everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aoife Luckland, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Irish Environmental Network. Welcome to the launch and the webinar of the report Monitoring Post-Brexit Environmental Divergence on the Island of Ireland, the Role of Civil Society. And just to give you a bit of background to this work, the IEN and our advocacy wing, the Environmental Pillar, we are the umbrella body for national environmental NGOs in the Republic of Ireland. And together with Northern Ireland Environment Link, the umbrella organisation for ENGOs in Northern Ireland, we've been working together for many years on improving North-South cooperation on the environment. So when the Brexit referendum passed, this work intensified as the risks from Brexit to the environment on the island started to become a little clearer. In 2019, we published a report authored by Alison Hock identifying these risks and exploring what role the Good Friday Belfast Agreement could have on maintaining cooperation on the environment post-Brexit. Since then, we've intensified our work in this area. Together, we conduct and commission joint research, we engage in joint advocacy, and we create space for North-South dialogue, most recently through our project, the All-Ireland Civil Society Forum on the Environment. So today's webinar presents the findings of our most recently commissioned report, and it's part of an ongoing work stream that we are running in conjunction with Environmental Justice Network Ireland, called Linking the Irish Environment. This project initially had a number of aims, chiefly in light of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Protocol in Northern Ireland, and the Windsor Framework, to examine how to enhance all-island cooperation on the environment, specifically to help NGOs, such as our members, to understand this new regulatory context post-Brexit, to outline the barriers and opportunities to cooperation post-Brexit, to provide recommendations to ENGOs on how to engage on an all-island basis, and how to deal with these shared environmental challenges. And then finally, to provide recommendations on how the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and UK governments can promote and enhance cooperation on the environment. So this research was conducted by EJNI and published in 2023, and a follow-up report authored by Lisa Claire Whitten on the Windsor Framework was published the following year. The report you will hear about today is the third in the series, and is focused on the role of civil society in monitoring environmental divergence post-Brexit. The authors, Dr. Ciara Brennan, Alison Hock, and Dr. Lisa Claire Whitten, will present the findings and take any questions you have. And as Ciara already mentioned, this presentation is being recorded, so please feel free to switch off your cameras if you wish. So I'm now going to hand over to Ciara.
Okay, that's great, Aoife. Thank you so much. I'm just going to start my little slideshow and can everybody see that okay? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so our report's going to come out today. I'm going to put the link to the report and to another useful document called it's a sort of a frequently asked questions document, which explains some of the more technical terminology that is used in this report where necessary, but we've tried to avoid overuse of the extreme numbers of acronyms that are present in this kind of discussion. So, but we do have those two documents, which we'll post in the chat shortly. So what we're going to cover today really we're just going to do a brief introduction. There's a little bit more to say beyond about sort of why we're doing this work and why we're doing it now. We're going to talk about what divergence really means in the context of the environment. Look a little bit at the arrangements for monitoring post-Brexit divergence. We're going to look at what this has meant in reality. What does it look like on the ground? And then discuss a little bit about some of the recommendations that we've made and the conclusions. And then, as Aoife has mentioned, we're very happy to take any questions. So I think one of the key things to consider here is why are we looking at this and why are we looking at it now? And I think it's important to note that there's been a number of recent studies that have very clearly articulated that a key threat posed by Brexit for environmental governance on the island of Ireland is this divergence in environmental regulation. Now, divergence in this context can mean a number of things. You've got legal divergence, regulatory divergence, practical divergence, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail later. But a key point to note is that all of these studies indicate that divergence in environmental regulation is going to make cooperation where it exists that is designed to address shared environmental challenges on the island of Ireland more difficult. And I think that's really why we are doing what we're doing in terms of research into how to kind of maybe overcome some of those issues. I think what has also been demonstrated by research, and this isn't just in the environment, this is across a whole array of different areas, is that there's no systematic or regular approach to monitoring divergence in environmental regulation. And this does stand in contrast to some other areas where there's been a lot of attention, for example, in regards to human rights or to areas that impact trade. So I think it's quite important to just note that environmental regulation, possibly because it is sort of a cross-cutting area, there's no kind of systematic or overarching monitoring of divergence that might occur. So we discussed this to some extent in the Linking the Irish Environment report that Aoife has mentioned, and this really highlighted that this was an area of deep concern for civil society, and it was an area that civil society needed to monitor in terms of trying to pick up what does this mean in reality. Um, so I think digging a little deeper into the rationale behind that, behind the need to do this research, it's important to note that prior to Brexit, and this has been discussed before, you know, there were important similarities that happened as a function of us all being in the EU. And this was really the need to comply with EU environmental directives and a lot of environmental law on the island, in Northern Ireland and in Ireland, really derived from that obligation to, to comply with EU environmental law. So I think it's important to note that that underpinned quite a lot of similarities, but it's also really important to note that even before Brexit, there were very, very significant differences in how environmental regulation was delivered. So you had important differences in marine planning, nature conservation, pollution permits, hunting licenses, issues like that. So that's something to bear in mind, that divergence isn't just caused because by Brexit, it pre-existed in many areas as well. I think another key point to note is that although environmental cooperation was written into the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement as a key area where it sort of just made sense for cooperation to happen, and although there have been some very important examples of transboundary environmental cooperation, um, that really the analysis, Alison Hawke's analysis from a few years ago now, still stands, that the potential for environmental cooperation has not been fulfilled. So there's much more that could be done to ensure that we're tackling shared environmental challenges together. So I think that's why it's quite important in this context to understand the full impact and extent of regulatory divergence on the island of Ireland. And that's really for a number of reasons, because as I've mentioned, existing cooperation on all island environmental challenges might be more difficult. Coherency between regulatory systems, north and south, may be reduced. So that's going to make it more difficult, obviously, for civil society to understand governance regulation or governance arrangements and implementation, especially if these are constantly changing. It's also important because new legal issues might emerge because of the divergence. So that's particularly important if, for example, divergence impacts on rights, on human rights of people on either side of the island. And that's the subject of a report that we actually have coming out tomorrow, which was commissioned by the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, and that's about the Windsor Framework and the environment and rights. So new legal issues might emerge, and also new cooperation might be required or advantageous in light of the divergence or because of the risk of divergence. So these are all reasons why it's important for civil society to think about this. I think, in addition, and one of the overarching things that has come from the interviews that we did as part of this report, was that divergence might simultaneously create new demands on civil society resources, or undermine resources. So there might be loss of funding opportunities as well, and that might also increase costs and barriers because uncertainties are going to increase as well. So I think that's why we think that we thought that it was very important to kind of delve into this issue of divergence in a bit more detail, and that's what we've done in this report. And we really needed to try to build understanding around the extent and impacts of existing divergence, the risk of potential divergence or divergence that's in progress, to kind of clarify the responsibilities for monitoring divergence and identify gaps in those arrangements, and really then to have a careful think about how civil society can plan for and mitigate the risks that might emerge around the issue of divergence. So, really, our overarching objective was to explore the extent to which post-Brexit environmental divergence across the island of Ireland is being monitored and to propose solutions that might enhance the ability of civil society to monitor and mitigate the impact of this divergence. And I think it's important to note at this point that we are talking about it as if all impacts may be negative. That might not always be the case, but I just wanted to flag at this stage that, there is this sort of overarching presumption that divergence is bad, but maybe it's not. If one jurisdiction decides to enhance an element of environmental regulation, that might then, raise the bottom line across the island as a whole. So I think it's important to bear in mind that if divergence is because one side of the border decides to go further ahead and be more progressive, then that could be something that could lift standards across the island. So just in terms of our approach, very briefly, we did a combination of desk-based and empirical research. We had some semi-structured interviews with civil society and other researchers who are working in this field. And it was actually really interesting even undertaking that process, because when we asked quite a lot of people to talk to us about it, but I think people were in many ways uncomfortable talking about the area because there's such a lack of knowledge about it. It's really complicated, really difficult. So I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody who did agree to talk to us, because you're putting your head above the parapet slightly with this, because it's such a tricky area to kind of to get to grips with. So and I think it's interesting in itself to note that many environmental organizations just don't have the capacity to have people who are looking at this in any detail. So what we'll talk about now is we'll go into a little bit more detail about what divergence means in the context of the environment. Then in the report, then we also moved on to talk about current arrangements, key recommendations, what the experience on the ground is. And then the report also includes actually a couple of very useful resources, which is there's a glossary of key terms which are used, which should be read in conjunction with the FAQs document, but also a bibliography of resources that we've used, because there's been some amazing work done by researchers working in the environment area, but also divergence generally. So we've flagged these, and there's a comprehensive bibliography in the report as well. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Alison, who's going to speak briefly about what do we mean by divergence in the context of the environment.
Hi, I'm Alison Hawke, obviously, and one of the co-authors of the report. And thanks to everybody for coming today to this launch of what is work in an extremely important, but I feel like slightly neglected area in terms of Ireland's environmental integrity. So, as Ciara has quite well outlined already, the cross-border cooperation that was taking place prior to Brexit has been diminished and affected by the departure of the UK from the European Union, which is kind of like the foundation of a lot of environmental law in both jurisdictions, in both Ireland and in the UK, and in particular in Northern Ireland. And this has occurred in the context of already sort of chaotic and problematic environmental governance on both sides of the border. So Ireland has a long history of non-compliance with EU law, particularly in relation to water, which is obviously a matter that has huge transboundary implications for Northern Ireland. And similarly, in Northern Ireland, there are massive issues pre-Brexit. There were massive issues with compliance with EU law and with international law obligations as well on both sides of the border. And you can see this from the decisions of bodies like the Compliance Committee of the Aarhus Convention, which had kind of found issues in terms of implementation of areas that ought to have been covered by EU law and weren't being effectively enforced. And you could do a whole other report on the problems with enforcement of EU law and the problems with enforcement of environmental law and environmental governance generally, but that's outside the scope of this webinar. So In terms of then what is divergence, there are kind of three categories that we looked at and identified in the report, because divergence is a term that's been used since the Brexit debate began. What's going to happen? Practices, laws, either side of the border are going to change. Will that make it the interoperability that we had under the EU system more challenging? And the answer is yes, it does. But people, when they use the word divergence, mean lots of different things. And the law, when it uses the word divergence, means lots of different things as well. So that the particular meaning that occurs within the kind of new institutional arrangement tailor-made for Northern Ireland, which were originally known as the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, and are now known as collectively the Windsor Framework. And that set of rules is designed to maintain this Northern Ireland in this imaginary space that had been created for it by the Good Friday Agreement, which is the space where it's both part of Ireland and not part of Ireland at the same time, and where you have, no borders and no kind of barriers to all island cooperation, but yet you do have different legal jurisdictions, different institutional governance arrangements, and all these kind of things. So the Good Friday Agreement kind of created this political imaginary that Northern Ireland has existed in, and the EU enabled it by creating a shared context, which made the kind of smoothed out the edges of all of the differences in terms of governance and institutions, and also gave oversight to it as well, that was consistent and uniform either side of the border, and that's been removed since Brexit. So the protocol and then Windsor Framework were an attempt to kind of put in place mechanisms to create, to maintain or keep on life support that kind of political imaginary status and governance status of Northern Ireland. And the problem being, of course, that there was a lot of pushback as well from certain parts of Northern Irish establishment that didn't want, the conditions for cross-border cooperation to be maintained, and they wanted to kind of move away from greater cooperation with Ireland. And they kind of then, therefore, that political pressure led to the creation of a mechanism that is quite narrow in terms of its scope, in terms of what it explicitly keeps in place. So the list of rules that are relevant to the environment that are explicitly, the list of EU laws relevant to the environment that are explicitly maintained, are quite narrow. And Lisa's going to talk about that in more detail, being the expert on that. But there's these more ambiguous mechanisms under the protocol that were designed to keep in place sort of the shape of the laws that did exist. And one of those is, as Ciara has mentioned, is Article 2, and the capacity for environmental human rights to be kind of read into the arrangements of the protocol and the Good Friday Agreement to be maintained, even though they're not explicitly set out in the protocol as being maintained in that way. So in the protocol, divergences occurs when the EU law that continues to apply in Northern Ireland gets changed since the end of the Brexit transition period, or where the assimilated version of the EU law is changed in the UK context. So that's the kind of like the legal concept of divergence. So it's literally where the laws go in different developmental tracks. So EU law goes in one direction and UK or Northern Irish law goes in another direction. And then for areas that are outside the protocol, Windsor Framework arrangements, but with devolved competence, divergence occurs where UK laws are revised or revoked, or where directly related domestic laws are revised or revoked, because not all EU laws were directly implemented by implementing EU law measures. Some of them were recognised to be implemented already by the existing legal framework. For example, the access to justice arrangements under the EIA directive were already effectively, some of the fair procedures elements of that were already in place under judicial review rules that pre-existed EU law. So if those were to change, you would have a divergence from the EU baseline, but not necessarily a change in EU law. So it's quite complicated in that sense. And then for areas relevant to North-South cooperation, divergence occurs where changes are made in the relevant EU law or policy context, and they take effect in Ireland, but relevant changes aren't made into the Northern Ireland framework. And then you have that kind of differences between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So you can have differences between the EU and the UK, within the UK between different devolved jurisdictions on changes to EU law, and then between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And some of the issues that causes then, I suppose, divergence, that's legal divergence. And that's what we mean when we talk about divergence most of the time. But then there are also like policy divergences, there are practical divergences. So, for example, one of the things that used to happen on a regular basis was a lots of, sort of organic and informal cooperation between councils. So councils in Northern Ireland and councils in Ireland that exist along the border formed groupings and took actions relevant to the environment, like, for example, in relation to waste, and sought funding together for joint projects and infrastructure projects to do with wastewater. And like there is some evidence that there is a fall off in that those types of activities, that the borders, the Brexit created this more kind of insular mindset in both jurisdictions, and that political establishments in both jurisdictions, both at local government and government level, are no longer looking to their counterparts across the border. And one of the areas where this most clearly manifested was in the failures to do transboundary consultations in a number of environment areas recently. So in Ireland, we saw this with the NECPs, so the national climate plans that were required to make under EU law. And there was no transboundary or no effective transboundary consultation on those plans, even though obviously an all island or a national climate plan is a plan that has all island implications, and vice versa. We don't see that kind of traffic across the border with climate plans, even the domestic climate plans either. We saw with the Sperrins, the Dalradian gold mining inquiry that collapsed because there was the failure to do any transboundary, consultation was exposed, and that led to a need to call a halt to the process until proper transboundary consultation was put in place. So they're kind of like that's a divergence in practice. The law on paper is the same. The law still requires in both jurisdictions in those cases transboundary consultation. They say it's on the paper, but it's not happening in reality because of a divergence in political mentality and political practice on the ground. The institutions and bodies that are charged with carrying out these duties no longer see the other side of the border as relevant to their activities because of Brexit, and that's something that's harder to define in terms of a divergence. And harder to capture in terms of like forming indicators for divergences. And a lot of the time, it's on a case by case basis, but when you add it up cumulatively with the amount of kind of different plans and projects that ought to have been consulted on, and the decline in the amounts of transboundary consultations that are carried out, we can see overall there is a weakening of that particular area of environmental governance in particular. So what are the risks caused by that? What's the problem with divergence? What's the problem with laws parting ways, or practices parting ways, or policies parting ways? So I suppose one of the big problems is that the idea of the interoperability between jurisdictions. So it makes it harder to manage a joint environment. So obviously Ireland is a single biogeographic unit, as we were so fond of saying on the previous version of the report. And to manage that effectively, you require a shared context, a shared legal and governance and policy and regulatory context. And all of those things are fragmenting and breaking down and are inadequately supported under the current governance frameworks. And that's leading to then problems with cross-border cooperation for NGOs, for management of conservation sites that are cross-border, for management of cross-border flows of waste and of pollution and air pollution. And we can see kind of increasing problems in all of these areas as well. There is also funding. So the funding problems that arose post-Brexit were huge, like the implications for cross-border environmental projects. And the changed regulatory landscape, or the changed kind of policy landscape and funding landscape, still hasn't been fully restored. There were efforts made to kind of admit UK back into Horizon EU-funded programs. SEUPB programs continued, but there was other kind of more overarching funding programs that did have a big impact on environment in Northern Ireland that weren't that were delayed for many years, or have not yet been restored. And so there's economic disadvantage as well. So when you have a drop in standards, so this kind of divergence is having a downward push on environmental standards on both sides of the border. And when you have a kind of an undermining of your regulatory standards, that damages things like investor confidence. And there's a huge link between economic success and strong environmental regulation, despite the kind of narrative that gets promoted in politics and in the media, particularly at the moment at both EU and national level in Ireland and also in the UK. But there is actually a huge benefit to your economy from having strong environmental regulation, because it gives certainty, it gives predictability. People know when they put their money into a project that the rules aren't going to change next week to make that less attractive. And they know that their project is not going to be undermined by, declining standards. So if you invest in a tourism project, it's not going to be impacted by the opening of an illegal dump right beside it the next year and things like that. So strong regulatory frameworks are really attractive to business, and particularly to foreign direct investment inflows. And they also can effectively direct investment. So if you've got strong environmental regulation prohibiting certain practices and promoting others, you can then see money follows those pathways as long as those pathways are kind of well enforced. And where those pathways are not well enforced, you don't see money flowing in because of that uncertainty and that risk that's created by poor regulation. So I think that's kind of something that gets neglected in the debate. It's not the focus of NGO activity in this area, so it's understandable it's kind of not the most talked about aspect, but it actually is something that I think it's important to remind economic actors of when they think that strong environmental regulation is not in their interest. And so it causes conservation problems, then divergence. So when you've got different laws either side of the border, that can lead to lowering of standards in one side of a habitat that affects a habitat the other side of the border. And then regulatory incoherence in general makes it more challenging for bodies to work together across borders as well. So, and then probably the most visible effect that we can see at the moment is the transboundary pollution problem, because of the lowered standards of enforcement within the jurisdictions, and also the kind of blind spot that's been created in terms of transboundary activity. So that's kind of a summary of the landscape there. So hopefully that makes sense.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alison. And I'm going to hand over to Lisa shortly to talk about really the arrangements that have been put in place formally to kind of monitor this and to what extent those are happening. So, Lisa, I'm going to hand over to you if you're okay to fire away with that bit.
Yeah, thanks, Ciara. So this will be quite quick because already, as Ciara set out at the start, one of the main takeaways in this report is that while there is some monitoring ongoing of divergence issues, and Alison's mentioned some of the different types and sort of axes of divergence that you can find, it's also true to say that the main issue point is that it isn't comprehensive, particularly from an environmental perspective. So in that first point, have the UK, Ireland and the EU established mechanisms to monitor and respond to divergence? The answer is yes, but those mechanisms don't cover, in particular, environmental issues in any sort of comprehensive way. So the report runs through the different mechanisms that have been set up and the different bodies that there are and groups and sources that you can find information on divergence as it arises, particularly in the Northern Ireland context. The focus primarily is on those areas of EU law that still apply in Northern Ireland under the terms of the Protocol Windsor Framework, rather than a more general approach to divergence in all its forms and types that we can have post-Brexit. So on the Windsor Framework applicable EU law, the report notes just the way in which that law, that sort of subset of EU law, intersects with what we can broadly understand as environmental policy. And there's a relatively substantial selection there, but when you look in the detail of it, you are talking about sort of primarily anything relating to trading goods and the environmental standards of goods. So those are important areas. Please forgive me, that is my tumble dryer that is beeping in the background if you can hear that. This is working from home, multitasking. Apologies. But in the scope in terms of the Windsor Framework applicable EU law that is environmentally relevant, if you read that against the breadth of what the EU does in terms of its environmental acquis, there is a serious discrepancy there. So there's a lot of areas that aren't covered under the Windsor Framework. And what that means then is that for those initiatives that we do have and bodies and sources that we have for monitoring divergence of Windsor Framework applicable EU law, they are only getting to a small subset of what is relevant for us in terms of environmental governance and management on the island of Ireland post-Brexit. The report goes through, I'm not going to bore you by all of the different bodies and their names and different approaches that they take, but there's a relatively concise overview in the third chapter of the report, so you can go away and flick through. In terms of areas where there is divergence happening and they aren't covered by Windsor Framework applicable EU law, so non-Windsor Framework applicable EU law, but that are areas that pre-Brexit were really important for North-South cooperation on the island of Ireland. So it's important to recognise that while there is no official monitoring resource there, no body or government or institute is taking responsibility for that, but there is a mechanism for inputting to the architecture that oversees the Windsor Framework to flag issues around divergence in environmental North-South cooperation in the field of the environment. But that avenue hasn't been used, but it is worth just noting that that's an important provision that is in there. But the prior issue there, and this comes to the broader question, and when we talk about divergence in the post-Brexit space, like Ciara mentioned, it sort of has a bad rep, which is often fair, but at the same time, it's not necessarily a negative thing if you're talking about localizing policy to the needs of a place. If you're talking about, one jurisdiction up in their game in environmental terms that then others follow. But the key in it all is that it's going to be more effective, efficient, and beneficial if it's being managed. And that's why this monitoring issue is really crucial. So in terms of mechanisms to monitor divergence beyond Windsor Framework applicable law, we have a potential to input through the North-South Ministerial Council and North-South implementation bodies to the oversight architecture for the withdrawal agreement and Windsor Framework, but that avenue hasn't been used very much, and it's fair to say that it would need to be bolstered and a bit more sort of development within the UK EU system to recognise that as a legitimate and important element of the Windsor Framework going forward. We haven't quite got there, partly because of the politics that Alison mentioned in the last few years. There are then some unofficial sources and sort of sporadic piecemeal sources you can go to for monitoring divergence generally, which sometimes touch on important environmental policy areas. But it does all come back to there not being this comprehensive, publicly available resource that monitors North-South divergence, and that is a really significant data gap for us. And for stakeholders going forward, seeking to manage well this post-Brexit complexity that we have in terms of environmental governance. Again, the report does flag just the areas that pre-Brexit North-South cooperation relied on shared EU law frameworks, and that's a starter for 10 in terms of where to look to see what has happened since in terms of what's moved already. And then it's also important to note that the new initiatives in the EU and new initiatives in the UK that, if not for Brexit, would have been being implemented on an all-island basis. That's also, those are important areas that are already, we're seeing gaps, and Alison's mentioned some of those. And we could, I could bore you on listing some of the interesting areas, but maybe we'll leave that for questions. The overall takeaway, more monitoring could be done. And what is being done isn't yet comprehensive, it's piecemeal, and it would be extremely beneficial to take forward a bit more monitoring based on our findings. Thanks, Ciara.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lisa. So I think that with all of that in mind, like with what we mean by divergence and with the extent of the monitoring and the current gaps, I think it's now time to step back. And this is what we did in the report to look at like, why should civil society care about this? Like, why are we here today? And why is this important? So we've already talked about the risks of divergence, but this is different because this is about civil society operating in the realms of the environmental world on the island. And I think it's worth just flagging a few of the reasons why this is something that should be on all of our horizons. So first of all, pathways to cooperation. Existing modes might become frustrated, and new modes of cooperation might be difficult to identify because if there is regulatory divergence on either side of the island, it's actually just sometimes difficult to identify who is your counterpart if it's organised in a completely different way down south. These are sort of wider governance issues. Given that we know that cooperation is underdeveloped in some areas, that those areas, it's unlikely that new cooperation might occur if there's increasing divergence as well. So that's one issue. There's legal issues, and this is something that's like it's quite difficult to pinpoint at times. But for example, policy initiatives on one side of the border might become frustrated or undermined on because of reducing standards or stasis on the other side of the border. So for the example that we've used before is that, you know, if smoky fuels banned in Donegal but not in Derry, and you can still go over the border and buy coal or, you know, something there and bring it over the border and burn it, then that's going to frustrate efforts in Donegal to and down south, you know, to limit smoky fuel, for example. So, but I suspect that there's a lot more practical examples of that, and it's particularly relevant in border areas. We've already mentioned that new legal issues might emerge because of rights. There's also issues with complexity and coherency. So engagement with shared challenges just does become more complicated, technically complicated, legally complicated. I mean, the number of acronyms alone would makes that really difficult. So, if coherency between regulatory systems in the north and south is reduced, it's going to be harder for civil society to understand governance arrangements and implementation approaches. And a big aspect of this is access and information about who's doing what if divergence has occurred but hasn't been identified. So knowing where it has occurred is really important. Risks and opportunities are affected by divergence because new cooperation might be required or advantageous, but the positive impacts of cooperation might become harder to identify and quantify. And as everybody here knows, that's what you have to put into all the funding applications. So, you know, how do we do that if we can't actually pinpoint what the positive impacts might be? That might be more difficult. And one of the biggest ones that came up, almost everybody that we spoke to highlighted the issues with costs and capacity because, like, there's very few environmental organizations that have a staff, or if any, a staff member who's going to sit there and be like, in whatever area of law the environmental organization or individual is working in, that it's very rare to have the capacity to actually have a dedicated person to monitoring that. And we also found, like this was highlighted in the link in the Irish Environment Report as well, that okay, you know, in many cases, all island cooperation or cross-border cooperation is considered like a nice to have. It'd be like, wouldn't it be great if we could work together on these challenges? And that becomes it's even, you know, it's more remote, you know, if there's divergence that has happened because the rationale to cooperate becomes weaker and weaker and weaker as it becomes more and more costly and more expensive and more complicated to do cooperation properly, you know. So I think those were the kind of reasons why this is something we should all be paying attention to. The biggest question that I sort of had at the outset of this was, you know, like what what's the risk of is divergence actually happening? Like, you know, is this something we need to be concerned about, or is this some remote risk that may or may not come to pass in the future? But the straight answer is that divergence it is already happening, and it became it's been identified through existing and ongoing research. There's really concrete examples already, including ambient air pollution rules, drinking water controls. This is because EU rules have been updated and the rules in the UK haven't been, or they have been changed. There's a lot of issues about transparency about when and how quickly this divergence is actually happening. Information is not available in a public or accessible manner. and there's still, as Lisa and Alison have also raised, a lack of clarity about how stakeholders can engage in these processes. But I think one of the big overarching things that came out of the interviews was that a lot of people are concerned that divergence is probably happening in practice, but it's unclear how to assess this or how to accurately pinpoint any of the consequences that emerge from it. So there's a general sense that this is happening, but because it's not being monitored properly, we can't really identify exactly where it's happening, why, how quickly, and all those kind of essential pieces of information. We know what's happening as well in marine spatial planning, conservation law, movement of trees and plants, freshwater management. So this is something that is happening and that we should be paying attention to. I also note as an aside that there's very important work ongoing by the Office of Environmental Protection in the UK, who are looking at issues around nutrient management divergence in the UK and EU as a whole, as well as North-South. And we were involved in that work as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that when that emerges, because obviously that's very relevant to a number of ongoing consultations, both north and south of the border. In terms of capacity to monitor divergence from a civil society perspective, our investigation essentially indicated that although several environmental organisations are monitoring divergence, at least to some degree in their areas of interest, or within their interest field or mission, that there was a low level of understanding about the extent to which it was occurring, and any monitoring was kind of limited and piecemeal and dependent on capacity. So a few different themes emerged about why this was. Capacity, as I said, has been an issue. Knowledge gaps about divergence. People just didn't know what to monitor. Like how do you actually, like where do you go to look to find out if divergence is happening? Do you have to like trawl through pieces of legislation to kind of find out what's been updated? And the straight answer is yes. That's what Lisa tends to do as a professional and maybe a hobby, Lisa, at this stage. But yeah, so like Lisa and other researchers at Queen's have produced really significant research for the Department of Economy in the North in 2024. So it's a step-by-step guide on how to monitor divergence, but it's complicated. I mean, you won't mind me saying, Lisa, it's highly technical work. It would be extremely challenging for civil society organisations without an expertise in this to monitor, or without in-house legal capacity. So I think, that capacity is a significant issue. There's also general knowledge gaps about post-Brexit arrangements. I think there's been a sort of drop off about understanding about these since the immediate wake of Brexit has happened. So as the new arrangements begin to bed in, that is becoming an issue, is that there's just a lack of understanding about what those arrangements are, how they work. It's very difficult to navigate the new complex governance landscape. There's a proliferation of initiatives, working groups, committees, task forces, agreements, commitments. We've got new political agreement between the EU and the UK, just I think it was last month. So getting to grips with that very complicated landscape is also an issue. And I think, again, it's hard to know how to use the existing bodies and processes to actually make your voices heard, as well. So the North-South Ministerial Council, for example, meets and discusses environmental issues and all-island cooperation, but one of our interviewees described it as completely impenetrable. So how do we overcome those existing barriers? Also, knowledge gaps about who's doing what. People just don't know who's working on what, and that can risk sort of confusion, but also duplication of efforts. And one of the ones that I'm certainly suffering from, and I'm sure other people in the call are as well, is consultation fatigue, because there has been so very many consultations, which is great because it's important for access to justice and public participation reasons. But there's only so many consultations that you can reply to, and if those are technical or complicated, there's a lot of capacity issues with that. So in terms of how we think this could be overcome, we've made and I want to kind of get through in case there's any questions, but we've made a few recommendations. We've got some options for enhanced monitoring. These are really designed to fill the gaps in monitoring divergence. So we've got mechanisms that are designed with the explicit function of monitoring divergence, and then we've got some more general steps which we think could be taken to protect all island cooperation on the environment and boost civil society capacity to respond to divergence. So, Lisa, you're okay to speak very briefly about the options for enhanced monitoring, and then I'll speak briefly about other kind of more general mechanisms. So, Lisa, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ciara. And yes, I will keep this nice and quick. So 3 options for enhancing monitoring. Option number 1 is to establish a civil society-led all-island environmental divergence observatory. And so this initiative, it would be based on publicly available information. It would be civil society led by like the needs and requirements of civil society for information around divergence. And it's sort of what we're talking about in that it would be a supplement to the capacity for civil society to do some of the trawling through legislation, sites, and understanding and linking up what policy documents from the EU mean read across to UK stuff. And it would be an initiative that allows, geeks like myself and the team who don't mind and quite enjoy doing that sort of work to put it together in one place and produce resources on a quarterly or biannually basis to then share with civil society to then take forward in terms of what this means in your specific context and sector, and then how that could be brought forward to more policymaker level. It's sort of just a resource hub, creating a resource hub for civil society on environmental divergence, crucially based on publicly available information. So it makes it flexible in that way. So it's not reliant on a higher level sort of sign up or official sign up from either of the governments or North-South bodies. Option B is option A plus, including environmental divergence on a more formal basis in the existing structures that I sort of high level mentioned that do exist for monitoring Windsor Framework applicable EU law changes. So on the basis that North-South cooperation in respect to the environment is a key area under the 1998 agreement, North-South bodies, and is recognised in the text of the Windsor Framework. So it would be getting that message across to the existing structures and allowing for more monitoring and more reporting into those existing structures for Windsor Framework divergence issues to consider environmental divergence. But again, we would see the first option sort of supplementing and contributing into that initiative to the existing architecture. Option C then would be taking it a step further. Again, option A plus, so you have that resource hub, but then enabling more of an intergovernmental, a dedicated government initiative, an intergovernmental monitoring body. So this would be looking at what already exists on a north-south basis and also an east-west basis. So it's the 1998 agreement model, but just sort of trying to upgrade that for the post-Brexit era. And recognise the need to have a view of environmental divergence on those east-west and north-south axes. But primarily we would see it under the North-South Ministerial Council because it already fits in the existing parameters of the work there. As Ciara mentioned, the sort of black box nature of North-South Ministerial Council meetings and initiatives does make that a bit tricky, but I think there is, and the report goes into a bit more detail about the case that can be made for that. So those are the 3 options. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just cut it there and pass back to you, Ciara. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to briefly mention a couple of the ways that we've identified that could help mitigate the impact of divergence as well. These are all detailed in the report, and we've drawn from international examples as well, like in some of the Baltic states as well, to kind of look and see what has worked, in other jurisdictions. But a couple of these are maybe the establishment of an all-island framework agreement or initiative regarding the environment in general to sort of anchor the need to try to maybe ensure alignment if that's possible, or at least sort of mitigate any instances of negative consequences from divergence. Dedicated funding assisting civil society to navigate the post-Brexit regulatory landscape as well as divergence. Investment in mapping and understanding the nature, extent, and practical implications of divergence. Some of these could be delivered by the recommendations that Lisa's spoken about. But I think as well that there's just in general a need to develop capacity to engage in the work of cross-sectoral, cross-border, like the ad hoc stakeholder working group led by the Centre for Cross-Border Studies, So it's finding ways to engage with the existing, sort of formal mechanisms and try to find ways of making the voices of civil society heard within those. You can use the tracking tool that Queen's researchers have produced for Department of the Economy. Mechanisms to try to enhance data sharing and transparency. And this really has to be bolstered by a far more robust approach to transboundary consultation, as Alison's mentioned. And then I think as well, one of the things that we've highlighted in a number of reports is enhanced rules for the 1998 agreement bodies regarding the environment and much improved routes for civil society engagement with those. I think as well, so that those are kind of what we've come up with, but I think by way of conclusion, and I'll just touch on this briefly and then we can take questions. We're very happy to stay on for 10 or 15 minutes beyond if people have other questions. But a key threat posed by Brexit for environmental governance is divergence in environmental regulation. Formal monitoring is extremely piecemeal, and this is a big gap in the post-Brexit governance and monitoring arrangements on the island of Ireland. Civil society organisations do not have the capacity to monitor divergence, and this is placing all island cooperation on shared challenges at risk. Dedicated monitoring mechanisms are required, and these must be supported by a range of other initiatives to protect and enhance all island cooperation more generally. And it's really important that civil society are equipped with tools and funding to ensure the maintenance and enhancement of cooperation to deliver what I think we can all agree are much needed positive outcomes in terms of the environment on the island of Ireland. So that is everything that we have to say on this. I'm going to stop sharing and stop recording now. I'm very happy to hand over to Sean, who's going to facilitate any questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sean. And that was a very interesting session. So first of all, I'd love to thank Ciara, Alison, and Lisa for all their work on authoring the report and for today's webinar. This is, as we've said many times, an extremely complicated topic. It's a very technical topic. And I think it's important that we find a way to communicate these issues in a clear and accessible way to people from multiple backgrounds. And I think we can agree that the authors have done this very well in this report and in previous reports. So just as a follow-up, we'll be sending the link to both the report and the video to all attendees, and the material will be available for downloading on all our respective websites. So it just remains for me to say thank you to everyone who attended today and for your time and for your questions. I hope it was of benefit to you, and I wish you a very good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.